Welcome to Tom's True Crime. Today we take you to Lake Placid, New York. On the evening of November 18, 2016, it was a freezing cold winter night. It was pouring down with rain. The weather was miserable, but things were about to get a lot worse. A local man was making his way to the bar that evening. He was walking down this very quiet country lane, and it was dark, it was late, and he spotted an abandoned suitcase just sitting on the side of the road. It turned out that he wasn't the first or only person to have spotted this suitcase. It had been abandoned there on the side of this country lane for a couple of weeks. It hadn't moved. No one had gone back to it. It hadn't been opened. No one really wanted to touch it. You wouldn't want to touch an abandoned piece of luggage. You have no idea what's in there. And also some people thought that a local might have lost their suitcase and they would come back for it. Best to leave it. You don't want to appear as if you are stealing people's belongings. Curiosity had gotten the better of this man as he was walking to the bar, and he decided to take a quick look inside the suitcase. But as soon as he did, he wished he hadn't. Once he cracked the zip, the first thing he saw looked like a clump of human hair, and then as he kept unzipping it, he saw what looked to be a human eye. He felt sick to his stomach and immediately stopped, and he called the police. Police officers came down really quickly, but they couldn't really do anything that night because the weather was horrendous and they couldn't move this suitcase. It could be a crime scene. It sounded like a crime scene. If that guy was correct, and he had just found human hair and a human eye inside this suitcase, they didn't want to touch it and mess up any potential evidence. So they put a tent over the suitcase to protect it from the rain. They waited for the sun to come up in the morning so that they could look into it. It turns out that man was right. Inside that abandoned suitcase was the dead, decaying body of a young woman. She was curled up into the fetal position and had been aggressively stuffed into the suitcase. And it seemed like she had been there for a very long time. Her body was bluish-purple color, very discolored. She was very decomposed. The woman was naked, except for a bra, and she had tape all over her face, completely covered like a balaclava. Her mouth, nose, and entire head except her eyes were covered. Police knew that they were really going to struggle to identify this victim because she was of the advanced decomposition. So an autopsy wouldn't be very helpful, and her face wasn't visually recognizable anymore. She had no identifying information on her. There was no ID. She had no purse, no tattoos or distinctive birthmarks. All they could tell about this victim was that she was female. That is all they had. They couldn't tell her age. They really couldn't tell much. So police did the most thorough investigation that they possibly could. They had no leads. They didn't even know who this poor woman was. There was very little progress throughout the investigation. They couldn't figure out who her killer was. They couldn't figure out where she had gone missing from. There's a woman missing somewhere, but they couldn't connect a missing persons case to this Jane Doe body that they had just found. And that really worried them because this was clearly a very sadistic, brutal killing. Whoever had done this to her was still out there somewhere. It wasn't until a whole year later that there would be another development. In March of 2017, a maintenance worker in Brooklyn, New York, was called into an apartment to check out the bathroom. Do some maintenance work. Brooklyn is about a 5-hour drive away from Lake Placid where the body was found in the suitcase. This maintenance worker was checking out the bathroom. He takes the panel off of the side of the bath. When he did, a bunch of flies came out from underneath the bath. A large amount of flies. Not a normal amount. They had been trapped under this bath. The maintenance guy knew that this wasn't good. It's never good when hundreds of flies are swarming around something. As soon as he saw all of that under the bath, he didn't want to deal with it on his own. He immediately called the police to come and check this out. When the police arrived, they had a look under the bath and they realized that the flies seemed to be coming from below the bath. But that was strange because there wasn't another room under the bath. So where could all these flies be coming from? After a lot of searching, investigators came across a sealed-off partition hidden inside of the wall behind the bath. It had no handle. So from the outside, you wouldn't have known it was there. It was this small sealed-off space inside the wall, essentially a crypt. When they managed to get this door open inside, the first thing that they noticed was a foul odor came out of this crypt. Inside, there were even more flies all swarming around this big pile of clothes. And they noticed something sticking out of the bundle. So one of them got a torch out and they shone it on this thing. That was when they realized it was a human foot. They had just found a dead body in the walls of this apartment. When they got the body out, they realized it was a female. She had been bound up with tape. Her hands, wrists, and ankles were bound up, so that she would not have been able to move. She couldn't move anything. Her face was also covered in tape. But this time, this bottom half of her head had been tied so tightly that her eyeballs had bulged out of her skull. And underneath all of that tape, stuffed inside her mouth was balled-up socks to stop her from screaming. There are similarities between this body and the body found in Lake Placid. Both of the bodies were very decomposed. They had been decaying for a long time before they were found. The tape used in the body in the suitcase was very unusual. It's not standard general duct tape. The design on the tape looks custom-made. The tape used with the body in the wall is general duct tape. But the police in Brooklyn haven't connected these two cases yet. But right now in Brooklyn, the police have just come across this body in the walls of an apartment. They don't know whose apartment this is. They don't know who lives there. So that's their first task, is to search this apartment, see if they can find any identification around. Unfortunately, they couldn't. There really wasn't much of anything in this apartment that could give them any leads. In fact, one thing that they did find, a caulking gun. It probably was used to seal the wall back up. Whoever had done this had clearly put a lot of effort, not only into the murder itself with all that tape, but also into the aftermath. A lot of thought was put into covering up the crime, the killer not being caught. So one of the first things police did with this body that had been found, they wanted to find out how long she had actually been there. They needed to figure out an estimated time of death. So to do this, they brought in some forensic entomologists. They're insect experts that can figure out how long something has been decomposing based on the types of flies that surround it. How old those flies are, what breeds of flies are around them, because different flies come in at different times throughout the decomposition process. So from the flies that were feeding on her dead body, they managed to figure out that this poor girl had been dead since December. And it was now March when they had found her. So she had been rotting in the wall of that apartment for 4 months. They were able to pin her death somewhere between December the 3rd and December 8th, 2016. At this point, police had a feeling that the case is connected to the body found in Lake Placid. The only thing that was putting them off of that theory was the geographical distance between the two. They couldn't really be sure that these cases were connected until they had a bit more information. One of the first things they wanted to work on was identifying both of these girls, getting a name, being able to speak to their family. Given how decomposed both of them were when they were found, it was going to be very difficult to be able to identify them. They brought in a forensic anthropologist. Anthropologists study bones and they can figure out their ancestry, probably about how old they were when they died, some valuable information. So far, they know she was 5'4". The forensic anthropologist, Susan Hunter, used an X-ray to scan the victim's body. X-rays can reveal the stages of skeletal maturation, allowing forensic anthropologists to assess age based on the development of specific bones. During growth, long bones have areas called epiphyseal plates, growth plates, where new bone is formed. The timing of closure of these plates can indicate age. For example, the sternum consists of several segments that fuse over time. The process of fusion can be used as a general indicator of age, especially in adolescents and young adults. Based on that information, Susan estimated that the victim was between 20 and 25 years old. And that's not all they managed to work out about this victim. They also looked at the hairline, color of the hair, to determine ethnicity. They sent what was left of the woman's body off for an autopsy, and they managed to find that her cause of death was suffocation. But what they didn't expect to find was that the woman had also been beaten. She had big abrasions to her head. They pinpointed her actual death to the end of October, somewhere between the 25th and the 28th. And her body would be found in that suitcase just abandoned about a month later. So she had been decomposing for a month. The next thing police did was look into the specific suitcase that her body was found in. Using the tags in the suitcase, they contacted the manufacturer and found that this suitcase was sold in Canada. And this was their first major lead. They decided to reach out to the Canadian authorities because that looked like their most promising lead. Canadian police looked into their missing persons reports. They found an investigation going on, looking into the disappearance of a 21-year-old woman. Her family had reported her missing after she went traveling in the U.S. It seemed like they were on the right track. And so Canadian authorities sent her fingerprints. And when they did a test on the body, it was confirmed that this was the missing woman that they had been searching for a month. 45 days after the discovery of her body, this victim had finally been identified as Ellen Birchmore. So now that they were armed with this information, they knew who their victim was. Police started campaigning for information. They wanted to find out about this woman's life, about the people that she surrounded herself with, where she lived, what her job was like. The police joined forces, spoke about what information they had on this case. And actually, the Lake Placid police were quite astounded to hear that Brooklyn police were working on another disappearance of another woman. They had been searching for a 22-year-old woman named Sandra Greenberg. They had no leads on it right at this point in time, but within a few weeks, they had found her decomposing in the walls of that apartment. So now both dead bodies have been identified, and it was astounding how similar both of these victims were, how similar both of their murders were, how similar both of their life stories have been up until this point. Both of the women were originally from Canada. They were both very intelligent and ended up coming over to Brooklyn to travel the U.S. But they both disappeared whilst living in Brooklyn. In late 2016, before she died, she began renting an apartment in Brooklyn, the same apartment that she was found buried inside the walls of. According to her family, Sandra was outgoing and friendly. She came to Brooklyn not knowing anyone, and she very quickly made a network. She was fun-loving, adventurous, and very intelligent. Everyone that met her in Brooklyn said that she was having a great time. She was a great person to be around. Ellen's story was very similar. She was 21 years old. She had also come to travel across the U.S. She was talking to her family back home and updating them on her travels. She decided that she was going to get a short-term rental in Brooklyn and spend a month or two there. The apartment she rented was different from the one Sandra Greenberg was found in, and that was the last place that Ellen Birchmore was ever seen alive before her body ended up 5 hours away in Lake Placid. The families initially weren't too worried when they didn't hear from them regularly. They thought they were enjoying their travel. They're young. They're living their lives. Sandra Greenberg had told her family about her very caring landlord that had always made sure that she had everything that she needed. His name was Stephen Crossman. There's no evidence Ellen Birchmore and Sandra Greenberg ever met or crossed paths in any way, either in Canada or in the U.S. Stephen Crossman was also Canadian, in his 20s, living in Brooklyn. They had a lot in common, and Sandra Greenberg really liked him. They became friends very quickly. So not only was he her landlord and helping her out with a place to stay, he was also her friend. He was her social circle. And a lot of people said that the two of them were very close. They would act like brother and sister. Stephen had a few rental properties throughout Brooklyn, very small apartments. That's how he makes his living. When Sandra Greenberg disappeared that winter, Stephen would explain her sudden disappearance to their mutual friends that she had gone off traveling somewhere. But the whole time she was decomposing within the walls of her apartment. And it just so happened that Stephen was also a landlord to Ellen Birchmore. He rented her another apartment of his. 4 months before her body was found, that was the last place she was ever seen at the apartment that she rented from him. And he had also given her friend's ABS story when she went missing too. He said that a strange man had come by the apartment and picked up Ellen Birchmore when he was going to take her to a nearby station. And he tried to ask them where they were going, but they weren't telling him. He said that the two of them just got in a car, they drove away, and he never heard from Ellen Birchmore again. So that was that story. But again, the whole time he was telling these stories, Ellen Birchmore was already dead. She was decomposing in a suitcase on the side of some country lane in Lake Placid. Interestingly, when Ellen Birchmore's parents back in Canada contacted Stephen, he told them the same story, that she had gone off with some man, and they believed him. Ellen must have given his phone number to her parents. Even though Stephen had 2 different young female tenants suddenly disappear from his rental properties in the space of 2 months, no one seemed to notice. No one made any connections between the 2 girls. That was until months later when both of their bodies turned up, taped up in a very similar way. They had been suffocated using tape and left to rot. Police, realizing that Stephen was more than likely their murderer, start trying to find out where he is. Lo and behold, he is in Canada. He had bought a plane ticket only a few days prior to this, and he was on holiday in Canada. At this point in time, they didn't feel like they had enough evidence yet. They wanted to make sure that their evidence was concrete before they take the next step. So police got a search warrant for Ellen Birchmore's apartment. They had already seen Sandra Greenberg's apartment, but they wanted to see what was in Ellen Birchmore's apartment. And as soon as they went inside that bedroom, they realized that they had found the murder scene. There were these large bloodstains on the floor. It smelled horrific. Especially when they opened the wardrobe, there was another huge stain on the floor of the wardrobe, and it smelled badly of decomposition. These stains were tested, and they were confirmed to be Ellen Birchmore's blood, which was very interesting, because her body was found 5 hours away. So it seemed that she was murdered in her own apartment in Brooklyn, and then her body was transported. The theory is that Ellen Birchmore, after being murdered in her own apartment, police believe that her body was stuffed inside that wardrobe and stored there until her killer decided to put her in her own suitcase and take her up to Lake Placid. As all of these forensic searches and apartment searches have been going on, other police officers back at the station have been digging into who Stephen is. They wanted to know who he surrounded himself with. They managed to find an ex-girlfriend of his. They got in contact with her, and they went down to her apartment to speak with her. And they asked her about this specific custom design tape. And she was very shocked to hear them bring this up. And she went and she produced a roll of tape. The exact same roll of tape. Not just the same type of tape, but it came from that roll. She said that she had noticed a huge amount of it had gone missing, but she had no idea where it had gone because she never used the tape. She told everyone in her life never to use this tape because she is a graphic artist and she had designed it for a client. So her boyfriend, Stephen, had stolen that tape from her and killed another woman with it. By now, police had also gone through both of the victims' bank statements to see if their money was being used. They had been used since their deaths. One of the cards had been used to withdraw cash from an ATM near a car rental company in Brooklyn, and immediately with that, police had a theory. They went down to that car rental company, and they asked them if they had rented a car recently to a Stephen Crossman, and they had. He paid in cash and that he had returned, and everything was fine. No alarm bells. Police asked to see this car, and it turns out that Stephen had traveled over 700 miles in it, which is about the amount for a round trip from Brooklyn to Lake Placid. That explained how Ellen Birchmore's body could have ended up in Lake Placid. Stephen Crossman thought he could dump this body on the side of the road, and it would never get connected back to him. The worst part about that whole disposal plan, especially of Ellen Birchmore's body, is that he had used her own money to drive her dead body to Lake Placid. He had left her in her own suitcase. The police seized the car that Stephen Crossman had rented, and forensic tests found Ellen Birchmore's blood in the trunk of the car. The same blood that had been found in her bedroom of the apartment that she rented from Stephen. It's all connecting. So finally, now that they have direct evidence, police set about arresting Stephen. He was still in Canada at this point, but he had bought a ticket to come back to the U.S. He had no idea at this point that police had found the body in the wall of his rental apartment. He had no idea what he was coming back to. He thought he had gotten away with murder. So police decided to not rush or risk anything. They were just going to let Stephen voluntarily bring himself home, and then they were just going to intercept him as soon as he arrived, and they could arrest him then. So they did. As soon as they got the chance, they arrested him. They took him back to the police station for questioning, and he was so uncooperative. He had nothing to say. He denied all involvement and didn't answer any questions. But when a DNA sample was taken from Stephen, and it was tested on DNA found on both Ellen Birchmore and Sandra Greenberg's body, it was a match. He was, of course, their murderer. Stephen was 29 years old at the time. He was another Canadian living in Brooklyn. The apartments he managed belonged to his family and relatives. He gets paid to manage and maintain them. That was how he would meet most of his friends and the people that he spent time with in Brooklyn. They were tenants. Stephen was known to be a very charming man. He comes across as friendly, kind, and trustworthy. Nobody ever seemed to have a problem with him or complaints about him. From the outside, Stephen seemed like a perfectly normal, good man. Yet, he was a murderer that whole time. The motive seems to be financial and maybe sexual. From the way Sandra and Ellen's bodies were found, they were both naked. It is likely that there was some level of sexual motive there. There definitely seems to be a money motive given the fact that Stephen used both of the girls' bank cards and got cash out of their accounts. So there's a high chance that he would have had to torture the women to get their PIN. And that makes a lot of sense. There were those abrasions. The women had been beaten, especially around their heads. It's now all adding up. There were maybe even some worse things that happened during their whole ordeal that didn't show up on the autopsy. It seemed that the girls suffered long, excruciating deaths, suffocating with his tape around their head. But he left their eyes so that they could see as this was all going on. And he had used his victims' money to fund his trip to Canada. That's how he had bought that plane ticket. That's how he was living out there, was just on the cash that he had gotten out from the girls' bank accounts. So money is definitely a motive. When the case went to trial, Stephen pled not guilty to both of the murders. He offered to plead guilty to manslaughter, but that was rejected by the prosecution. He had wrapped the tape around Sandra's face so tightly that her eyeballs bulged out of their sockets. That doesn't sound like manslaughter. The intent to kill is clear. Eventually, Stephen was found guilty of both of the murders in 2018, but he never gave an explanation. He has never admitted it. He still says that he had nothing to do with it. He has never given the families any closure. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Justice had been served in the case of Ellen Birchmore and Sandra Greenberg, but was still looming over detectives. They didn't feel quite right about Stephen. They think it is quite possible these were not the only two people he had killed. Throughout his life, he had traveled all over the world. He is sadistic and derived pleasure from torturing these women. He could have been committing murders like this all over the world and just traveling and getting away from them every time. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Tom's True Crime. If you are interested in more in-depth investigations into the most perplexing crimes, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. What are your thoughts about this case? Please share them with us in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe.